I'm Marie Price, President of the American Geographical Society, and today I'm honored to have a conversation with Dr. Carolyn Finney, who is an AGS medalist. She is receiving the Melamede Medal. She's a cultural geographer, an environmentalist, and a storyteller, and she lives here in Vermont. So we're taking advantage of a beautiful autumn day to have a conversation. Welcome, Carolyn. It's so nice to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I've read your work, and I've done a little biographical research, and I came to the realization that we're the same age.
Yes.
And I would imagine that when you were a little girl looking in the mirror, imagining who you would be, becoming a geographer probably wasn't one of your dreams. It certainly wasn't one of mine.
Well, I wasn't, I mean, I wanted to be an actor, I'll be really clear. But the thing is, when I was 9 years old, for a year, there used to be a program, and I don't know if it was Scholastic magazines or what company it was. Every month, I received a box. My parents signed me up for it, and I would get a box, and the box would represent a different country. So the box would come, there would be a booklet that would tell you all about a country, a stamp from the country, a craft from that country. So, you know, I got a box from Ecuador, and it was these beautiful windpipes made from there, and a map of the country. I loved that. I still remember that every year getting that box. I remember what came from Hong Kong. I remember what came from India, the Philippines. I mean, I can still flash back to that. And so that's when I became fascinated with the idea of maps in its real simplest form, in the simplest form. And I didn't even know geography was a thing. I also had a pencil box. It was a yellow pencil box. I haven't thought about this in a long time. That has the United States on top. And if you can learn the capital of each state. Like there's a little windy dial thing. And it's so funny. So I really got into that. So I would say the real fundamentals of geography, you know, where are we in relationship to this other place? What is it like culturally? I was drawn to immediately, but I didn't know geography was a thing.
No, neither did I. And I'm glad I found it. For me, it was travel and a chance when I was young to open up my mind to different places and people and that relationship between culture and environment. Is that similar for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't realize geography was a thing until I was probably 38, 39 years old. And in part because I pursued an acting career for 11 years. Then I took 5 years where I backpack in different parts of the world. I did a backpacking trip around the world, which ultimately changed my life in 1987. I had dropped out of school. So I had dropped out of school, pursued my acting, was thinking about what I might like to do next. Am I going to stay with acting? But I became really interested in the world in a very particular way. And there's a longer story there about why I did that backpacking trip around the world. But when I came back from that, and at the time I was young, I was in my 20s, I had been married. We did that trip together. I came back and thought, what if I could do a trip like that on my own? So I became obsessed with travel adventure, particularly if I could find books by women, but I read everything. Everything about every mountain climber, person who's crossed the desert, who's rowboated around the world, whatever the story was. Sora Wilby, who walked across the Himalayas, or my favorite book of all time is Robin Davidson in Tracks, who crossed Australia with 3 camels and her dog. I became obsessed. And then I'd save my money, and then I spent 6 months in East Africa backpacking. Then I'd come back, and it would take me another 6-8 months to save money. Then I went back to parts of Africa again. Then I came back, and a friend of mine said, why don't you go live in a place? And I picked Nepal. I had been there briefly on the Around the World trip, and I thought, I did some reading, and I thought, I'll go to Nepal, and I ended up staying there for a year and a half. That was from 92 to 94. And it was during that time I started thinking about how I might go back to school. Because now I'm in my mid-30s. I had never finished my bachelor's. What was I going to go back to study? Because as much as I love traveling and the adventure of it, in the purest sense, I actually wanted to be engaged with the world. So how do I talk about the things that I care about? What does that mean? As I have these amazing experiences at a time where I never saw anybody who looked like me anywhere I went, right? During that 87 to 94, there was that period of time where I was out there in the world in a very particular way. And so at that point I went back to school, but even then I thought I'm just going to get a bachelor's and look for a job. And I did an interdisciplinary degree at Western Washington University at Fairhaven College. Excuse me. And as part of that degree, I did an exchange program to live on a women's farm in Kenya for 6 months, so I could learn about how women are engaging economically, I went to this was 1995-96, I went to the women's conference in China that was on that year with a group of women from the Seattle area. That was amazing. And somebody said, you should get a master's. I took a year to work at a drop-in center for the homeless in Seattle that used to be there called Street Outreach Services, thinking maybe nonprofit, but I applied to a bunch of graduate schools. I got into all of them, but, and I always say to people, romance gets in the way a lot. So the guy I was going out with at the time, I wanted to go to American University in Washington, D.C. because I had gotten I'd gotten an internship at the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, and I was really interested in Bhutanese refugees in Nepal because I had spent so much time there and had been at the camps there at the time. And I got in American, but American University didn't give me any money. So I got in everywhere I applied, but they didn't give me any money. My boyfriend at the time was more frugal than myself because I was borrowing anyway. And my last choice had been Utah State University because he'd gotten a job there. But they gave me some money, and they had an interdisciplinary program called International Rural and Community Development. And I thought, because I was looking at international development and women, so I picked that program. And as part of that program for my master's, I spent a semester back in Nepal looking at women in community forest management. It's a longer story. I built relationships over time, so I kind of created these opportunities. And during that time, professors were saying, why don't you get a doctorate? It was not the plan. I just wanted to be out there working in the world around this. But someone said to me, you're a black woman. If you have a doctorate, that more doors will open up in terms of what you might be able to do in the world. And remember, I come from a really artistic, creative background, and that's actually where I like to stand. I'm most comfortable in that space than I am the, how can I say, sort of the social science, academic space. But I love school. So there's a way, I just love learning in its broadest sense. So at that point, this is where somebody said, well, if you go for a doctorate, what are you going to go for? And I didn't think you could get an interdisciplinary degree. This was, I was looking at this in 1998, which is where I wanted to go because I was challenged by the idea that academia often has us siloed, and I wanted to think about how we are all in relationship with each other. And a professor looked at all courses I had taken, because I was thinking anthropology. And I had taken GIS, Geographic Information Systems, because what I was interested in was maps and its impact on people and the technology's impact on how people were able to engage and whose knowledge counts. So I was already there in that way. And then he said, you know what, you're taking a lot of courses here that cross-list with geography. And I was like, geography? What's that? And he said, well, it's about human-environment relationships.
And you're like, that's me.
That's me, exactly. That's the moment I was like, ding, ding. So when I applied, I still wasn't looking at programs that did it. I was looking for the people I wanted to work with. And there were 3 women. One of them had been Janet Mommsen, but my first choice was, no offense, because Janet's amazing, was Diane Rochelow, because I loved everything that I read about how she thought in an interdisciplinary way, the way she thought about practice, the way she brought, in the broadest sense, a feminist understanding to how we practice what we do. So it isn't just about how we think about it and how we talk about it and how we write about it, but it's how we do it. How do we walk the talk? And her, I just think she's brilliant. And the way that she just would seem like she'd have an abstract idea and she'd put it all together, but it worked. And I said, well, I think like that. Like I just pull this over here, pull this over here. And the rigor is, how do you make them make sense together, right? Because I think everything's in relation anyway. But so that's why. And my first choice was Clark University. I have to, and I apologize to anybody listening from Clark. I didn't realize what a brilliant program it was. I just wanted to work with her. So when I get my sights on something, I was like,
this is it.
I went and visited, I met a number of others, I got in, and then I got there and then I did my research and I was like, this is the oldest geography program in the country.
A storied department.
Then I got really intimidated. I have to say.
Well, I think you did okay.
Well, the first year there I was really intimidated because I was one of the oldest students in the department. I was 40 when I started that program. I looked good, but I felt the weight of my lived world experience. How do I bring that to an academic setting? And I had a lot to say. All those years I spent living and traveling abroad and seeing the things that we were talking about, the books were talking about. I was like,
Yeah, I've seen that.
I've seen that. And here's this thing, how do we actually talk about that differently? And Diane was so wonderful because she gave me one of the best pieces of advice I got in grad school, which is do what you do and do it well. People may not like what you do, but if you do it well, they'll respect it. Because
I got similar advice, and it served me well.
It served me well because I was very quiet, believe it or not. My first semester there, in classes, I was very quiet, which was not my nature to be quiet because I was so overwhelmed by all the language of academia and of theory and of ways of knowing. And it took me about a year, and I went, oh, because she said it's just like learning a language. She goes, you'll get it.
Right, the terminology.
Right. And I went, oh, about a year in, I said, I get it now. Yeah.
So you use the term radical presence when discussing the role of Black environmental activists. And just the notion of radical presence suggests that Blacks are not often in the environmental conversation. And how does that square with the work you're doing and the voices you're trying to elevate?
Yeah. So I would say it's probably been about 10 years ago in Washington, D.C., there was a showing, an exhibition called 30 Americans. And actually it was 30 African American artists who showed different aspects of American life through the lens of the Black experience. And they purposely didn't call themselves 30 African American artists. They said 30 Americans, but they were trying to make a point. And part of my idea of radical presence came from how that show was defined and how I experienced it. And I think this is true for any group of people. And in talking about African Americans, trying to elevate the understanding that no one operates outside the context of the complications of our lives, including Black people. So if we want to talk about a Black environmental experience, we can't do that historically without looking at slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. I mean, all the things that inhibit the ability of anybody to move in any space. We have to look at those processes. Neoliberalism, we have to look at all of it, right, to really understand the complexity of those decisions. And so when I think about redlining, Jim Crow, and slavery in particular, and I think about the idea of radical presence and the Black experience, that in spite of that, or despite those processes that were in place, and in my opinion, we still live within the legacy, George Floyd, all I need to do is say George Floyd to understand the legacy is still there, the repercussions of that, those moments in history are still here, that despite that, Black folks have been living very fully, in terms of being in relationship to the environment in very specific ways, carving out their own life. I'm not saying it was easy or hard. I'm not making any judgment on that, but to understand that it's a radical idea to consider. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I think that some of the ideas of outreach, some of the ideas of well-meaning, predominantly white environmental organizations and institutions that say that we have to reach out to communities of color, we want to, and sometimes that comes from the best place. But sometimes one of the assumptions embedded under there is that they don't have the experience of the environment.
Good point.
Right? And I always want to say, first of all, if you were born, you have an experience of the environment. If you were born and if you're breathing, you have an experience, you have a story. And that assumption gets, sort of then you start to create and build upon this power dynamic that privileges a certain way of seeing and engaging the environment over another's. And even if it's got all that good intention in there, for me that's really damaging, right? And I'm being really light about it, but it can be really damaging too. And the ability to actually see a group of people collectively as being more proactive, engaged than they actually are. They may not be engaged in the way that you or I engage, but that doesn't mean they're not engaged, right? And it doesn't mean we all don't have things to learn about non-human nature and the environment itself. So radical presence in part was to kind of elevate it to this place of hopefulness, potential and possibility, not always downtrodden and terrible and horrible. We all experience bad things in our lives, and African Americans are one group in this country, but not the only group that have suffered and continues to suffer at the hands of a history that hasn't always seen us fully for who we are and who we can be. So the radical piece in part is to help us to think, people aren't only the bad things that happen to them. right? So their possibility and their potential. I get it that the last chapter in the book, I want to say, I don't want to spend all my time talking about how bad things have been for us, but I have to hold people and processes accountable for how we got here to really understand the truth of that in the broadest sense. But who we can be, I don't want to just talk about all the bad stuff that's happened to me because I'm Black. Who wants to talk? Or because I'm a woman, or because I'm this or that. That actually, God, that just shrunk me from this to this.
So, it reduces your radical presence.
Yes, and it actually reduces our potential collectively, because ultimately we're all in relationship with each other, right? If I think about climate change, if I think about any issues that we're all trying to, maybe not all of us, but many of us are trying to lean into and understand and change. How are we going to do that if we don't have everybody tapping into, you know, their greatest possible vision at this moment?
Right. So the theme of this conference is towards a more equitable future. And it's a theme that I care deeply about, because all of us living and breathing on the planet realize that there's greater and greater social and economic inequality. And to put this in a positive light, what steps need to be taken towards greater equity, and particularly looking at the work you've done with environmentalism? Where do you see the environmental movement in the future, and hopefully greater successes if there are more diverse voices and actors involved?
Well, one of the things that I often say to folks in environmental organizations, you know, for instance, is around the question of sustainability. What is it that you're actually trying to sustain? You know, I think that, you know, organizations and individuals have to take stock of really where they are, which means that they come from a history. Their mission statement, which may seem really beautiful and wonderful, may be unintentionally exclusive. And there were times in history where it was intentionally exclusive as well. And so it's like you have to dig into the foundation. Lately I've been saying to people that you may not have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you definitely need a new bathtub. Right? I mean, really. And if you're feeling comfortable where you are doing this work, then I say this with the greatest of care, then you're probably not doing the work, because there is nothing comfortable about this kind of change. It's fundamental. It's getting down into the roots of who we actually say we want to be, and what are we willing to risk in order to do that. Because this is about changing power. The idea for me of an equitable future is all about healthy relationship. Our relationships to each other, our relationships to non-human nature. How do you have a good relationship with anybody? I mean, really. That means you got to be really, to pull back some, peel back some onions, tell some truths about yourself, be accountable to that truth, not canceled out. I really have big problems with cancel culture. I understand the impulse, but for me it solves nothing, right? It doesn't hold anybody accountable, and it doesn't give anybody the chance to become redeemable, right? The idea, I believe that all humanity is redeemable, right? And so how do we practice that? That is in part where equity for me is tied into our ability, not just for the people who've done the bad thing, whatever that is, to sort of show up better, but for all of us to show up better. What does it mean for me to still stand in relationship with you? It doesn't mean I even have to agree with you. Equity for me is not about agreement. Equity for me is about a space that allows both of us to show up as whole people and take that step into kind of an unknown future. But we've got our house in order, both individually and together, about how we might want to do that. When we think about, I forgot the group, maybe a week or so ago, I was talking to, it was at Middlebury, and a student asked a question about what kind of solutions we need. And I said, it was a panel of us on stage, and I said, what if we replaced solutions with relationship? We get caught up, I understand why we do it,
right?
But we jump right to that, often without considering, if we don't have a good vision, how do we think we're going to come up with a good solution? And if we don't have a good relationship, how do we think we're not going to perpetuate those power dynamics that create those inequities as we charge towards that solution, right? Thinking, well, the solution is more important. I'm like, no, actually the solution is not what's more important. This is what's more important, because that's what we should be trying to sustain over the long haul. The solutions will change.
Yep. I mean, it requires a lot more empathy and a lot more listening, which a lot of people are ready to give you the answers.
Yeah.
So one of the hallmarks of your work is that you talk and engage with so many different sectors. And this is something the American Geographical Society tries to do too. We talk to people in government and business and academia, and these groups can be quite siloed.
Yes.
But you are very intentional in doing that.
Yeah.
And you've advised the National Park Service, corporations, you work at a university. So what drives you to do that?
Ooh, that's a good question. Part of it is my own life, which I can't be easily pigeonholed. You know, people who know me for the last 15 years, they say academic. People who knew me before 2005 were like, you're an actor. Other people say, you were that person who took off and were backpacking all the time. You're that person who grew up on an estate that didn't belong to your family, who and your parents worked on that land for 50 years in this wealthy neighborhood. You're that person. You know, like everyone else, I'm complicated, right? And I like that. For me, it's how do we stand in the complexity of who we are? How do we do that with intention? So it challenges me in my own practice if I'm invited to speak to, you know, I have no real experience in business. But I certainly understand human beings because I'm a human being. That's what I mean. Not because I have some special understanding, just because I'm one, right? And so I always come in thinking, well, what do I want to do? My intention is to meet people where they are. So I don't go anywhere unless I'm invited, because people have to own that invitation, because I'm going to talk about some hard things. And then how do I weave together story? I put my own story in there, both to remind us that, you know, I'm just a person. Just like you, everyone else, we're just people here. And we're not the same. And so how can I use my story and connect it to a moment in history or a current story in the news or a subject matter? How can I weave it around to give you multiple opportunities to access this in a way that works for you? I'm not trying to force anything on you, but I am trying to offer you a different way and a more expansive way to sort of understand this, that there's room for you. There's room for what you care about. There's room for your ideas and your way of life even. I believe that there's room for it. Doesn't mean those things don't have to shift and change. Mine do. I mean, that's part of, I think, living as a human being, is that we have to shift and change, because life shifts and changes. Nature tells us that all the time. You know?
We've certainly learned that in the last year and a half.
Holy, we are still learning. Okay, right? We are still learning, really. We all got thrown for a big loop.
Yeah, indeed. So Carolyn, one of the characteristics of your work is this intentional cross-sectoral engagement. You teach at a university, you advise the Park Service, you advise corporations. So what is it that drives you to work across all these different sectors?
Well, probably the primary thing that drives me is the fact that I've always worked in different sectors, right? I was an actor for a lot of years in the performance field, and among other jobs that I held during that time, I spent 5 years backpacking and got really up into that world in a very particular way before social media. And then I went back to school. And so all of those ways of thinking about, I, without realizing that, I was building up this kind of understanding that there's ways that people talk about a lot of the same things, the basic things that we care about as human beings. The idea of love, the idea of, home and belonging, identity, power, privilege. We all these things show up in all those sectors. And so part
Maybe
of
different vocabulary, but they show
different
up.
vocabulary, and what's fundamentally the same is that we're all human beings doing it, even though we're not the same as human beings. So part of my intention is always to meet people where they are. I don't have to know anything about corporation if someone invites me in because they want to have a conversation about diversity, inclusion, equity, environment, place, land, to say, I have a meeting with them usually. They say, so tell me, you're inviting me. I only come if I'm invited, but tell me what you're thinking about and why you wanted to bring me in. I get a sense of what it is they want, and then I fashion together, whether it's a talk they want me to give, whether it's a facilitated conversation, whether it's a workshop, using story, a way to help them think about that as who they are and who they say they want to be. right. So, and at the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter to me. It matters less what they do. It matters more to me what the question is you're asking. What is it? Where are you trying to go? And how I might be able to work with you, get you a little further down the road in the conversation.
That's a good way of putting it,
Yeah.
and especially dealing with these complex issues of environment and race and culture and equity.
Yes, well, all of which has always been in play. It's always in play. So sometimes it might be that my role becomes to highlight those for you because you haven't seen them or haven't had to see them because privilege has kind of created a vacuum for you. So you're not realizing that this is all what's going on. And here's how these things are in part connected to what's happening at this moment. One of the, in the last year, 14 months or so, I would say since May 2020, I counted, I've done over 150 virtual. And that's not including writing, I am not including everything, at least, of people asking me to have this conversation. And I always start from where we are right now and where I am. Because part of what's underneath, I'm going to talk about some things, but it's also how do we practice that? Right. And so part of that is you have to be clear about where you are. You have to be present. You have to know where you stand. You can't know who you stand with until you know where you stand. And it's not about judging where you stand because we're all biased. It's about just being clear about that. So you're less likely than to unintentionally, negatively impact someone that you're supposedly saying that you want to work with to do something better. You can kind of come to that more responsibly. And there's something about, I learned this a number of years ago, perhaps because I was an older student, the power, when I was finishing graduate school, the power of when someone asks you a question, the power of being able to say, I don't know, with confidence.
Yeah. People are afraid to say that.
Exactly. But I saw how it opened up the person who was asking, or the people, or other people going, oh, look, and she said that like with confidence. Okay, and I can say, well, maybe someone else here. And I would say, well, maybe someone else here knows that because I hadn't thought about that, but that's a great question. Let's go down this road together. And suddenly it creates space. And so I'm also about how do we create space for new ideas, for the I don't know.
For the I don't know. And there's a lot of that.
And there's a lot of that, and as there should be.
Right.
We live in a life that's changing all the time, every day.
As we were very much reminded since March 2020.
That's right.
And that pivot to you've travel and talk and now going to the virtual presentations, which I would have thought didn't work that well, but I've come to reassess there's some value in the virtual world.
I think there's some value too. I mean, I miss what I find hardest is part of what I feed on is the energy that is mutually created by being in the presence of others.
Right.
And I was actually more exhausted this last year than I was before when I was getting on a plane every week.
Interesting.
Because I was having to create all the energy. And most of the time, not seeing anyone. There might be 300 people, but I'm seeing maybe one.
Right.
And so I have to and I'm creating it sitting down. I'm not standing, I'm not in front of people, and we're not going out and having meals and getting a sense to know each other. I'm not getting a sense of the place we're at, that they live in.
Or getting a reaction.
You're right. There's all of that is not there. So now it's just flying on my own, whatever I'm flying on. And that is finite. That actually without the relationship.
Right. So Carolyn, tell me about the projects you're doing right now.
Well, so you've caught me too in a moment of transition in terms of thinking about how I want to move forward. So this past year, what with George Floyd, and for a series of, I don't know how to call it, just not accidents, but just people coming together at the same time. The New York Botanical Gardens had reached out to me and asked me to do, if I wanted to do a residency there, which I did, but we had to wait till this summer that it could be in person. And one of the things that they said, so what's the next book you're working on? And there's a book that I want to work on that has more of a memoir feel around, I call it, the second half of the title is Geography of a Black Imagination, but to understand and think about race, identity, place, land, belonging through my own story and my parents' story on the land. And as part of that story, and I said, well, I want to work on that book, but the other thing is I want to kind of do a one-woman show. because I love giving talks. I want to combine the performance around this, the storytelling around these issues. How can I do that better? And back in 2016, the centennial year for the parks, I was getting asked a lot of questions about John Muir's relevancy. And at the annual geography conference, a plenary session was put together. Actually, myself, Laura Polito, there were a number of us that had been asked to sit on that and answer the question, is John Muir still relevant? And in my response to that, we were told we had 10 minutes. I prepared for it. I said, instead of just answering a straight answer, I kind of created this sort of slightly more theatrical response to it. Taking one of John Muir's works and imagining what if a black woman had written it. So I'm going to rewrite it and take some quotes and compare the quotes to the two, how they might have experienced the landscape at that time and how they would have experienced it differently because of who they are. And then imagining what if I was in a conversation with him, and I wrote a scene with John Muir and I made it kind of funny about what if he and I were to talk and meet, what that was. And so when I said this to them, they said, well, why don't you, if you're working on that, why don't you do a reading here? Make that part of your 3-week residency. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this, and I'm trying to tell you this in the shortest fashion possible. In 2019, I had been invited to speak at the Telluride Film Festival, and the theme was around environmental films. So there was all these filmmakers and it was amazing in Telluride. But the theme was equity that year. So they invited myself and Robin DiAngelo and a bunch of other folks who talk about these things to talk about this to this largely film-based audience. And there was a filmmaker in the audience who I didn't meet at that time, who reached out to me last summer, named Irene Taylor, who has won Emmys for her documentary films, and said she's been commissioned to do a film for HBO on trees and people's relationship to them. So what she wants to do is tell singular stories of different species of tree, but real people. So one of the stories she will tell is of the Weyerhaeuser family, who made a lot of money off timber. But she said what she realized after listening to the talk that I gave, where I said whose story counts, and I showed images of where I grew up and kind of leaned into some of the stuff I talk about all the time. She said she had no story in there for African Americans, and she reached out to me. We had a Zoom conversation. She said, can you help me think about that? And I said, well, it might seem obvious to tell a story about lynching and black people and trees. And she said, well, but I'm not the person to do that. And I said, and we're not just the bad things that happened to us. So I told her the story of how my father had given my mother for their 40th wedding anniversary a weeping cherry tree that they weren't able to take with them when they had to finally move off the land, the property. She loved the story so much, she decided she wants to tell the story about my family and this weeping cherry tree. And the whole thing sort of snowballed over the year of, New York Botanical Gardens. How could we get access to this estate? There's a conservation easement on the estate now. So building relationship with the Westchester Land Trust and finally the new owners. It all culminated back in July of all of us descending on the estate. Now, I hadn't been on the estate in 18 years because I had no access of the estate where I grew up. And the HBO film crew filming that, as well as the president of the Westchester Land Trust, as well as a young forester who basically did all the work of replanting this new tree. And there's a whole story in there. Coming off that and me doing the reading is because I was thinking, well, I'd love to take this. I'd end up telling this fuller story of who my parents were and who my family was on this land, and raising larger questions about race inequity and our history here in this country and how we move forward with that. Thinking maybe I'll ultimately take this around. I'll work with a director. I'll think about what it means to tell the story more fully. But in the last 2 months since I've been doing that, and I've done it about 2 weeks ago, I did it in New Hampshire, I realized I don't want to necessarily stand up there and tell a story of myself for an hour and 10 minutes. That's actually not what I do. I do bring my story into it, but I'm more excited about my story in relationship to your story, in relationship to other stories, and how we kind of show up in that. And I'm actually getting a little tired of using the foundation of the estate I grew up on as the story that I tell. My primary impetus for going back to college, there was 2 things I was thinking. One, I really wanted to think more deeply about ideas of social inequity and difference and belonging and land and all that kind of stuff. But the other was that I wanted to tell the story of, I spent 5 years backpacking around the world at a time where I couldn't see anybody else who looked like me doing it. And I saw a lot of people writing books about that. And a couple of years ago, the feminist writer Bell Hooks said to me, she was getting to know me, she lives in Kentucky, and I told her I did all this stuff, and finally she looked at me and said, "That's the Eat, Pray, Love I want to read. When are you writing that?" Before Eat, Pray, Love was written, because I also did it because I was trying to save a marriage. When I saw that, Eat, Pray, Love, I went, oh my God, that's I'm from there was a lot of similarities there. And so I want to use, there's something about that story that I can use that to still have these conversations. Because I have to keep it fresh for me. I'm actually, I don't want to get stuck in that I'm saying the same thing in the same way, because nothing stays the same.
Right.
So how am I evolving? And I want to be in service to the ideas and the potential and the practice and the praxis, not just in service to myself. Having said that, you know, I'm going to just own the fact that there's personal healing, you know, around this work about living in a world that may not have ever fully seen me as having value, or people who look like me, and broadly, people who are just seen as different. So this doesn't have to be about race. It can be about a whole lot of differences that we don't necessarily recognize in the way that different kinds of people show up in the world. And so I want to be in service to that. And how do I take the risk? How do I do the thing that I ask others to do? You take a risk in order to gain, instead of taking a risk in order to hang on to what you already have. So I'm not interested in simply hanging on to what I already have at this point, but thinking about how am I willing to leap into this sort of unknown? And as I was driving here to this beautiful place today, I was thinking, you know, it may be time for me to take a chunk of time and get out there in the world again, and stretch my own learning and talk to people and hear new stories and think of myself as a 61-year-old woman out in the world, a 61-year-old black woman out in the world, a 61-year-old black woman who's an African American in the world, and all those things, all those labels. But also, what does it mean to see the world now through the lens of the place where we live now, with all the things that I've come to learn and know, but are still trying to understand? And how do I share that? Is it through writing? Is it through talking? Is it through all of it? And also the question of self-care, because this work, for me, around equity, social justice, is exhausting. And if you are bringing your whole self into it, burnout is real.
Right, you have to nourish yourself.
Emotional labor is real. And a lot of people have been telling me, who know me well, said, you are tired. And I said, yeah, I can tell I really am. You know, I'm also really passionate about it. And it's also tied to how I make a living. So I need to be, it's all in there. And I said, so how do I keep it fresh so that I can bring that when I'm in a relationship with somebody else to do this work? So what's next?
I think there's advice that I received as a young graduate student was, there's always value in going back to places. So maybe in your return with new eyes and a whole lot of experience and wisdom, not only will it be a journey of self-discovery, but a journey of rediscovering places that you probably hadn't thought about in a long time.
Yes, I love that, right. And so therefore rediscovering myself, and also rediscovering who we all are collectively, who I thought we were, you know, and how much I've learned from so many different kinds of people and so many different kinds of places, actually. In my life, I've been really privileged to have that opportunity in a way that my parents never did, you know, so.
Well, Carolyn, thank you for your time. Congratulations on receiving this medal, and keep on doing what you're doing so well.
Well, thank you for the honor, and I say this, trying not to get emotional, but to be acknowledged and to be affirmed, because I've also found that sometimes a world doesn't know how to see you and hold what it is you do as having value, and I think everybody wants a little bit of that. So I so appreciate being here and being upheld in relationship with all of you as geographers.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much.